Guten Morgen. Da. Okay, I want to talk about Alexander the First of Russia. He was Tsar of Russia from 1801 to 1825. Give a little bit about his background. He was of the Romanov dynasty in Russia. Which kind of means that he had some other infamous family members that have definitely made it to the history books of some kind. His grandma was Catherine the Great, whom he really admired. His great-grandfather was his great-grandfather was Peter the Great. And his father, Paul the First, but not so great. Some of the other titles that he held at the same time being Tsar of Russia he was very important positions in the Polish and Finnish governments. And a little known fact that the Romanov family actually came from Finland. Wasn't so celebrated in Alexander the First's reign, but they showed more Finnish pride in being supposedly Russian when his nephew Alexander II came into power. Let's see here. So talk a little bit more about his family. Literally, his father was a basket case of some kind too, and a little bit of research that I found out. Schizophrenia ran in the Romanov family. His father, Paul, not so great, was not a very good ruler per se. He was only Tsar for like 5 years. His mom, Catherine II, didn't really like this that well because she really didn't want him to be Tsar of Russia. She didn't want him to succeed. But she made a pact with her son, and she literally sat down with her son to say that he was not going to rule Russia, but she died unexpectedly anyway. But there was no one else to take over Russia at the time, so for the short amount of time that Paul was Tsar, it came to an end. Doesn't say exactly who is involved with this conspiracy. Supposedly that Alexander had one of his higher ranking officers kill his father because he knew that he wasn't, not just because he wasn't right in the head, but he was kind of a tyrant too. Kind of like Caligula and Nero in the Roman Empire. But since I said that schizophrenia ran in their family, that Alexander the First, it would finally catch up with him too. But I want to talk a little bit more. Let's see here. A little bit about the culture of Russia per se, before the young men were being groomed, which was very much so, that they had their own private tutors. And Alexander, he was a very gifted student. But being born and raised in the time of the Enlightenment, he was born in the year 1777. He was very much influenced by this move. We're going to talk a little bit more about that in a few seconds. So what the Russian aristocracy, boyars, I think that's what they call them. They send their young guys they send them away from Moscow, the supposed center of Russia, which the capital has moved a couple times over the years from St. Petersburg during the time of when Peter the Great was Tsar of Russia. Then it eventually moved back to Moscow. So they sent the young men away around the country, and a little bit around Europe too, to I don't know the exact words, to toughen them up, man them up, so they can grow up in some way. So they weren't exactly so naive about life in general. But they didn't exactly get rid of all this naiveness when he was a little bit older, when he came into power. It was a big part about how he admired Napoleon, which turned out to be a pain in his arse towards the end, that kind of defined what and who he is and what he stood up for. But at the same time, too, the reason why they sent the young men around the country to man them up, per se, is that the boyars were really picky about who their czars were going to marry. In Russia, that there was a pattern going about that a lot of the tsarinas were chosen from Prussia, per se, for various reasons, for mostly diplomatic reasons. In a sense that his bride was arranged. Her name was Princess Louise of Battenberg, in which in turn that she did not really get along with his grandmother, Catherine, overly all that well, but that's not the point. So let's get into it a little bit more. He was wanting to put a progressive movement and continue the works of his great-grandfather and grandmother in Russia, per se, that they want to Europeanize Russia. A lot of scholars, historians felt that Russia was lacking culture. They were behind Europe, per se, mostly because of its geography, how it's located next to Europe. There was, I suppose, maybe like a communication gap, or they just weren't as modernized as the rest of Europe at that time. Alexander wanted Russia to have a little bit more of a liberal approach. He was known about it in Russian history, but it really wasn't talked about that much, per se, in European history at the time. Thank you for the like, appreciate it. He tried really, really hard to liberalize the country, because there was like a big change that was coming on in Europe at the time. But he wanted it to come from, he really wanted it to come from Russia, but someone else had a little bit more of a idea about how they were going to change the map of Europe, per se. Some guy by the name of Napoleon Bonaparte had his supposed way in how he was going to change the history of Europe. Oh, and I skipped over a part. Oh, it's not relative here. Oh. So I'm just going to dive right into it a little bit more about Alexander the First. some of his contemporaries of his times in the Enlightenment period of the late 1700s couldn't quite figure him out because of being from Russia. He was what's my word I'm looking for? He was absolute monarch. That just meant that he's a czar. Period. My country. This is the way it's going to be. He literally was trying to keep up with the Joneses in Europe by changing the absolute monarch born into place by birthright per se, and he wanted to turn it into a constitutional monarch. His other plans at the time, he was wanting to free all the serfs, not smurfs, but serfs, peasants per se, to give them a little bit more of a place in society. His other plans were to build more colleges at the time. You could probably say that he was a visionary in Russia at the time, but he could never really carry out that because of the French Empire that was being built in and the Enlightenment that was happening at the time. He wasn't able to keep up with that. And basically what his stance was, he was very proud of where Russia was going, but he needed to protect his country from Bonaparte, and he kind of had to grow up and man up a little bit to take care of this new threat that was coming from France. So moving on, sorry about the sidetrack on that. So he is Tsarina, what's her name again? Her uncle was Frederick III, Frederick William III of Prussia, who was in charge of, or who led one of the largest standing militaries on the continent of France. Alex was a very, very, very brilliant leader. He felt like he needed to make some kind of alliance with his uncle because of this new threat coming from France, whom he thought that would be a very formidable frenemies with Prussia per se. To actually stand up to France, because he didn't know exactly what he was up against per se, but he tried to wisen up by his uncle by marriage, by Frederick III, which in the long run turned out to be a flop. Just more on that in a little bit though. So basically that Alex was very fascinated by the French culture, and he brought it back to Russia with him, kind of like his great-grandfather kind of like his great-grandfather Peter did, who Russianized his court by having all of his cabinet members literally shave off all their beards and introduce the French language to the Russian court. But I don't think it doesn't look like that he actually went to that extreme, but he just wanted to introduce the culture of what France was like and how supposedly how sophisticated they are. But at this time, when he was trying to get the idea of more of an idea of what the Enlightenment was really about, he ran into this guy by the name of Bonaparte that he was just simply awed or floored by. By the way that he led his country, but he felt like that there was like something about him, but he just never could quite wisen up to about what Bonaparte was really about. He admired him as a leader because Bonaparte had a lot of qualities that made him a very good leader, general, emperor, whatever, madman, whatever you wanted to call Bonaparte back in the day. for the wrong or yeah, like for the wrong or right reasons per se. So, but what he was naive about, he didn't realize how much how Bonaparte wasn't exactly a nice guy, even though we really, really thought he was, and he was. He had to come find that out quite some time after that he was kind of ruthless, and to be a czar in Russia, sometimes you had to be ruthless, even though he was a nice guy on the outside, but he had to be kind of ruthless on the inside to like flex his muscle to show his people that who was in charge, supposedly. Um, so Alex was not, when I was saying he was like very, very naive about what Napoleon Bonaparte was actually capable of, he was one of the very few countries that actually entered into agreements with France. But he kind of alienated himself against Britain, Austria, and Prussia, because they knew exactly what Bonaparte was all about, especially Austria. They had their on again, off again feuds with Bonaparte, and at the end of Bonaparte's rule, that at Congress of Vienna, Austria was the country that did not gain the most at that. More on that in a little bit. So it wasn't exactly love at first sight with Bonaparte by the point of view of Alexander Romanov per se. He started to see like what Bonaparte was actually capable of, and that's kind of the way he started alienating himself from the other leaders of other European countries, i.e., Britain, in Austria per se. It started to develop into a love-hate relationship, because actually, it's like within the first couple times they actually sat down with Bonaparte, they actually supposedly, I'm going to paraphrase, trying to quote somewhere around here, that he thought he was like brilliant, but then he got the first taste, or a really good look in his eye of Bonaparte's eyes, and just kind of reminded him of his father so much that he thought his father was a tyrant. And then once he saw, or what supposedly what he saw in Bonaparte's eyes just reminded me, excuse me if I just said this, he just reminded him so much of his father that he was just like appalled by Bonaparte, because he thought he was a tyrant, and quote unquote, he was one of the biggest tyrants the world has ever produced of the time. That then and there he thought that he was totally being used by Bonaparte. I mean, he thought he was being backstabbed and being taken advantage of for various reasons. Alexander was so upset, or excuse me, take that back. Alexander was so naive to what Bonaparte was capable of. He actually talked Alexander into executing a certain diplomat from Britain, who shall remain nameless. Literally executed him without a second thought. Did the dirty work of Bonaparte, and there were a lot of people, i.e., the aristocracy and other leaders and kings and queens across Europe, that were just like baffled and appalled about the merciless killing of this diplomat from Britain for France. The very much hate relationship between France and England, still alive today, even in sports. Okay. So Alexander, he vowed he was going to try to the best of his abilities to get back at Bonaparte at every chance that he got. Eventually formed a coalition to get rid of the French, or to get Bonaparte to surrender, to get him out of power. But so with Alexander and Russia, they teamed up with the other big two countries on the continent of Europe, Britain and Austria. But at the same time that he used his family connections, his brother, his brother that was very much associated with the Orthodox Church, the religion of Russia per se. He wanted to try to get support from the traditional enemies of Russia, like, of the Turks, the Polish, and the Persians. He was trying to sell this war to the Turks, Persians, and the Polish as a holy war to drum up a little bit more support from what I guess you could probably call the old world against the new world, I guess. But he was still kind of nervous about what Bonaparte would do before they actually sat down, or before they actually started trading fire, that he tried to make negotiations with Bonaparte about not invading Prussia. So Bonaparte was willing to sit down with Alexander to make some kind of agreement not to attack certain states in Prussia. But like the ruthless jerk Bonaparte was, that he kind of went back on that agreement and went in and attacked certain countries in Prussia, what they called like he attacked so many of these states in Prussia per se, and he made up his own confederation. Basically taking all these German states and making them a part of the French Empire, knowing that all of these states combined would be a great, very, 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 did I say very, a very, very big threat to Bonaparte's domination of the European Empire. Talked a little bit more about that in one of my last speeches. Literally, that after Bonaparte went in and ransacked Prussia, that Frederick William III made a compact with his nephew to seek protection from him after Frederick William retreated all the way back to Russia per se. So to show how ruthless Bonaparte was towards Russia, i.e. Alexander, that he marched his army into Russia with his goal trying to attack Moscow and take Russia for himself, and made the mistake attacking in the middle of the wintertime, literally losing a good majority of his army due to the cold climate of Russia in the middle of winter, somewhere in December, I think, and I'm not sure exactly what year it was per se. But in retaliation of France attacking Russia in the middle of the winter, I was going to guess, if I had to make a guess on what year that was, it was probably around the year 1810, 1811 or something like that, that Alexander was very furious and really wanted to get back at Bonaparte for going back on their words with about not attacking Russia. So he formed a coalition with his buddies from Austria and Prussia, and they had Spain and Sweden get involved. So literally, all these countries banded together and they went into Rome. Try this again. They went into France with the goal of ousting Bonaparte from power, which they did. The very first time, supposedly at that time, was first time that outside armies marched on Rome, and Bonaparte was captured and arrested and sent to the island of Elba, right next to Italy. Per se, is like the little soccer ball, smaller soccer ball, kind of looked like a smaller soccer ball, right next to the island of Sicily, literally right out in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea. And there could be a little bit more talk about how Napoleon escaped from power from there, but we're going to just kind of continue on the course of talking about Alexander per se. That we come to one of the last points that I wanted to talk about was the Congress of Vienna. Basically, how the other big countries in Europe were going to carve up the French Empire and do their best to try to give back all the lands that supposedly belonged to other countries before Bonaparte came into power. They tried their best to divide them up equally, per se. It's not always possible, but the goal was to divide up the lands, like I just said, like 2 times before, to make some kind of an agreement that another tyrant or one other country would never be more powerful than any others. So something like this could never happen again. Wink, wink. Austria kind of got the shaft on this because they were a little upset with Russia and Alexander per se, because they didn't get their share back, because Britain, Prussia took kind of the majority of what came from France per se, and Austria was very insulted, I guess you could say, from what they got back from France, or at the Congress of Vienna per se. So they really, really, really wanted to stick it back to the Russians per se. They kind of thought that Alexander was some kind of a bully per se, because they kind of thought that he was some kind of an egomaniac, that he always acted like he had something to prove against Bonaparte per se. And they always thought that Alexander was always trying to save face per se, always trying to make himself look good. So their plan was the Austrians, they sent an envoy to Poland. They came up with a plan to kidnap Alexander. It didn't exactly happen, but Alexander found out that Poland was in a conspiracy with Austria to kidnap him, to spur on some kind of a negotiation with Russia to get some kind of a compensation against France for all the crap. Hi, Alan. That Napoleon pulled on Austria per se. Another long story that we could talk about for a while on that. Let's see here. Alexander the First kindly sat down and talked with Metternich, the diplomat from Austria. Basically told him to go F off kindly, and did an about face on the rest of Europe. And he wanted to roll the way he wanted to roll, not because of not because he didn't know that there was another big event coming up in Europe at the time, what they call the time of revolutions, and he didn't really want any part of it, but Russia was going to feel that. And when they fell they fell hard. And Zach kindly fell on deaf ears because his hand-chosen successor, his nephew, was going to feel that wrath per se. Um, didn't exactly quite get done in his time by trying to reform the government and trying to make it liberalize the government a little bit more, introducing trying to get some kind of form of parliament going in Russia so that the power wouldn't exactly all be absorbed by the Tsar per se. Making education a little bit more of a priority, freeing up the press. What's the other one? So you wouldn't like censor the whole press, which literally opened the door for a revolution to come into Russia. Long story. We'll talk about that some other time. And I really, really, really want to thank you, everyone who joined in. Y'all have a great day. Bye-bye.